Greetings, Marsh here, and welcome to episode 230 of my modded Factorio playthrough. In the last episode, we fixed all of the problems introduced by the fairly recent Angel Bob's update, and now that we've got that taken care of, we can start thinking about how are we going to handle our next tier of ore sorting, tier 3. Well, first things first, let's make sure it's been researched, because that'd be kind of bad if it wasn't, but I think that it was. Yep. We kind of needed to research that to take it a little forward, I think, for advanced chemistry or something or other. We needed to take this, but we kind of skipped it. But it, as a review here, it gives us a leaching plant. And what the leaching plant does is it takes the chunks, you add some of the acid, which, by the way, is acid that came from making the chunks. So it's kind of a closed loop in that sense, to turn them into crystals. And then those crystals can be processed. Now, instead of doing them in groups of 6, you do them in groups of 8. You still get the 1 slag as a end product, but since it's a group of 8 now, it's even less slag compared to what goes in. And you get a little bit of extra. You still get the primary resource. So like saphirite will give you iron, and so does givelite. Stereotite and crotinium give you the copper. Rubite gives you the lead, and bobmonium gives you the tin. But it gives you 2 more rare resources on the end of it. With saphirite, we'll get nickel, which we already have, but we want the titanium. And then we'll get a cobalt from givelite, a uranium from stereotite, a titanium from crotinium, and we get a gold from rubite, and another gold from bobmonium. So we're still going to have a logical process like this, where different machines are turning on and off. It's just there'll be even more potential things to turn on and off based on which resources we need. Specifically, you see that each one of these is producing 4 resources, so they have up to 4 combinators to turn them on and 4 to turn them off. And it's 4 combinators for this side and 4 for this side, and then the other set to turn them off. So that's how we have the 16. Well, if we have 2 more potential resources that we're going to get, then we need 2 more potential combinators. But at least in this situation, it looks like we'll probably only need to have 5. Because of the way that works. It looks like it's giving us 1 extra of the primary resource and then 1 extra rare resource. Because you do the hydro refining and it shows you that we get our 4 outputs. So only 1 more combinator in there. But nonetheless, it will be additional complication. And we already researched the filtration units and crystallizers. Because now we will be able to make any available ore from the mineral sludge. So that setup will get more complicated, although I think it's going to be a lot smaller. We haven't used it yet, but I've been dealing with it constantly when I'm setting recipes. Instead of setting the item, it sets the recipe for the item, which is odd until you realize that's for the recipe combinator mod, which I believe is this crafting combinator we need right here. Sets or reads the recipe of an assembler. And pretty much everything that makes things in Factorio is an assembler, including these crystallizers. So instead of having a line for each ore type, we will only need to have 1 line and then a combinator and an absolute huge number of wires to set them all. And that is how we will be able to change the logic. And we will need to update this logic too for the extra resource types, but it's basically the same thing, just more of them. Hopefully this won't be any bigger. With modules and everything, it'll probably be a lot smaller. And in that sense, with the modules, maybe we won't need the crafting combinators at all if we have a bunch of speed modules. So we'll have to see. We will be able to make anything we need there. And at this tier, I think the only thing we're not making naturally is tungsten. So if we check through here, we're getting titanium, cobalt, uranium, gold. So yeah, tungsten is the last resource we won't be able to make with this method. But we could make it in small amounts with the mineral sludge, so we will have access to it, which is nice. And I don't think we need to worry about these other processing chains. They're basically just, more things you could do with filters. And from there, after we get those better ores, we'll need to start researching the other steps here, but we can worry about that later. But as an overview of how you make plates in Angels, it's a 3-step process. The first step is sorting the ores. So in this situation, we ground them up, turn them into chunks, and then they get sorted, and that gives us, like in this case, copper and tin. And that gives us all of our base ores. And they go through all of this to get sorted and to have logic. And it's worked out pretty well. I will go over it again for review if you didn't see that episode. It's quite a few episodes ago, probably 100 or more. This has been here a while. But the second step is the ore processing stage, where it gets processed into better forms of ore if possible, and then turned into ingots. And the reason why this stage is kept separate is because these ingots get sent all over the place for different forms of alloys. And it's only going to get worse when we add more resources to this. And you can see, based on how much space is being taken up by this, we're going to need to change it, because we can only produce 4 belts of copper a second. But we have all of these just because we're using them as logic. But this is getting insane. So we're going to have to update it, and it's probably going to be done in a similar way to this, where each input, there's a warehouse, and basically it has logic to turn itself on and off based on the status of other warehouses, so you can give a priority. And the advantage to doing it in this way is you only need the minimum number of belts for however many items you're running. So it's more complicated, and it requires these warehouses, but you only need the minimum number of belts. So we're definitely going to want to do that, because we just don't have the space to make this any bigger. So we're going to have to do that. And the third and final stage is taking those ingots and turning them into plates. And in many cases in this part of the game, it's turning them into coils, which can later be chopped into plates. You keep them in coil form because the coils are 4 times as dense, which is why we get away with having 1 belt. So you see that we have 4 belts of copper going into this. But then you look at the bus, or any bus that has copper, it's just this 1 line, even though 4 belts went in, because it's all been squished into coils, which makes the logistics of using a lot of resources so much easier. So you always want to use coils if possible. So that's how that works, but for now, we're going to want to focus on just the first stage, making it into the ores. And I tried to design this in a way that it can expand. So we have room on the left here, at least a little bit, not much, if we have more sorting types to push these out to the side. And we have room above, right here, to expand upwards to leave more room in the middle for our extra stages of processing. And in this case, it's the leaching plants. So things are going to have to move. And looking back on it, I probably should have just placed these up here to begin with, leaving all this space in the middle empty. But since I didn't, they will have to be shifted up. So my hope is that with our better machines and our better modules, we can take each one of these setups and squish them down and leave room for the leaching plants. So a lot of this can stay the way it is without us having to move it around. That might be a pipe dream. So unfortunately, we still may have to rebuild a lot of this, or at least I will. You will see it happen very quickly. It'll take me hours. But we certainly have way better modules now, especially now that we have Module 5s, and better machines than we had access to before. Before, we had no modules at all. So we're going to be able to make this a lot more compact. And these train stations could be moved, but I'd rather not, so they'll probably stay stationary. So before we start designing this, we want to kind of think about the logistics of it. So one thing we're doing here is we're processing every available ore type. So we're taking 2 belts of rubite, crushing 2 belts of rubite, because it's a 1-to-1 ratio there, and then half of that, so 30 rubite a second, gets washed into rubite chunks, and the other 30 stays as the crushed. Now, which one is better? Well, it depends. Technically, the more processed version is better, but to process things requires extra materials you may not have access to. So what happens if we're doing the leaching and we run out of the acid we need to process it? Well, if we have these other methods, we will have lower tiers available, so the whole factory won't come to a complete stop. And that's one thing I've definitely learned with Angel Bobs, is you want to have pretty much multiple, if not all, available recipes for a particular thing active, and then use logic to determine which one actually runs. Like in the case of Rubite, you might think, well, what's the difference? Why not just run the best one? Well, it's because the output is different. So let's say we wanted lead. Well, crushed Rubite gives us 2 lead for every 4 input. But if we used the Rubite chunks, we would get 2 lead for every 6 input. So we're actually getting more byproducts with the air quotes better refined resource. And it gets even worse with Rubite crystals, where we put in 8, but we only get 3. So that's kind of why there's all this logic attached to these, because if you look at every possible way of producing ore, there's a best way, there's a second best way, there's a 17th best way, or however many ways there are, you could sort them into a list, and that's what was done here. So that's kind of why I like running everything at the same time, and it's worked really well. Like, this thing has not clogged at all, and I keep this up to keep an eye on what all the ores are doing. And they fluctuate, but they're not 0, and they're not at 80, which is the maximum, so they stay between that range. So this has worked out really well, and I'd want to do the same thing again. But one thing to keep in mind here is, since this is a 1-1 ratio when we process things, now that we're adding a whole nother tier of processing, we're making these chunks. That means that we're actually increasing the factory's output of ores by 50%, because first we were making the crushed and the chunks. We're making 30 of each, and now that we're making an extra 30 of the crystals, we get a 50% output. But because they feed into each other, it means that we need to do more processing. So right now we're crushing 2 belts of Rubite. Now we're going to need to crush 3 belts of Rubite. And here we are washing 1 belt of Rubite, but now we need to wash 2 belts of Rubite, because 1 belt is going to be kept in the washed form, and 1 is going to go further to be processed into the crystals. So it's definitely going to get bigger. And this bus will get bigger, because it's going to have another 6 belts. So we're going to need some amount of space to expand, so there's that. But we should be able to survive with these red belts, because 30 per second has been working pretty well. It's kind of surprising that the factory is this big, but this is really the only input that goes into the factory, and it's actually worked out really well. In part because it's just, I put so much effort in everything being materially efficient. But there's some considerations. One failure, I think, of this bus style is that I was making the combined ores, where you take the 3 different ores and you crush them together. So where this one, I say it goes up, where it takes crushed stuff and turns them into crystals. The other method, where you add the 3 and crush them down, where you start with crushed and you get a mixture, and then you turn it into powder, and then you turn that powder into sludge, and then that sludge goes into dust. So it's like going down. This is actually more efficient if you follow this here, because when you do the crushed method, where you add all 3 together, you get no slag. It's only materials. And that's the case for all of them. So it's technically the most efficient way of running things, and also requires no catalyst either, which is really powerful. But the flaw here is that I'm pulling the same crushed resources from the main bus here that are getting used for sorting. And many times, the most ideal sorting method also involved these crushed resources. So what it meant was, let's say we're making iron from our Givelite and our Sapphirite. It meant that almost none of it was available for making the powder here. Some was available because of the use of productivity modules, so some was left over, but not a lot. Since this is such a good method of making resources, I kind of want them to have their own input. So what that means is, from our crushed ore, we probably are going to want to have 4 belts of each crushed ore, because 1 belt is bypassed and gets used directly, 2 belts are going to get turned into chunks, of which one belt is going to get turned into crystals, and then that last belt is going to go here. So the way that this is going to be set up is going to be different, because it would be kind of weird to send 2 belts up here just to be here and down. It would be much better to like send them down here and then up or something like that. So we're going to want to look at that. And certainly the lack of blue belts is kind of annoying, but it doesn't make a lot of sense to build a whole processing setup to make the cobalt and then turn it into plates, put them on our bus to make blue belts, when we're just going to completely change it again when we update all this for the tier 3 stuff, because it's going to be like a one-off thing. So as useful as the blue belts would be, I kind of don't want to go through the effort of making them right now. But this does expose a potential problem with our factory here if we upgrade. So right now, if all 6 of these are going, we will have 6 belts of crushed stone. Because the way it works is when you crush an ore, 2 ore go in, 2 crushed ore come out, and then you get a stone. So basically half. So if we're making 2 belts of crushed ore, we get 1 belt of crushed stone. So if we are going to double the output of each one of these, it means instead of 6 belts, we would need 12. And certainly having the blue belts would help, but we would still need 9 blue belts, which is a lot. And it's getting to the point where we really can't keep making it bigger, because not only is there not space here, but this sorting warehouse is basically maxed out already. So we can't just keep scaling this up. We have to change the way that it's done. And we've already done this in other situations. So for example, right here, we are processing our wastewater directly where it's being produced. And the reason for that is because each one of these setups by itself takes 750 of the purified water. And in Factorio, you get about 1,000 per second out of a pipe. You can get slightly more, but without having pumps right next to each other, that's basically what you should expect to get. So this is about a pipe already. So if we produce this water elsewhere, we would need like 4 or 5 water pipes just for this. So to save ourselves having all those pipes, we just process the water right next to where it's used, so we don't have a logistics problem. So can we do the same thing with stone? Well, yes, because right now we're sending the stone down to get sorted. What actually happens to the stone? Basically only 2 things. You know, I mean, you can just follow it right here. I mean, there's 6 belts of it. It either gets turned into regular stone, which has its uses and, you know, can be turned into bricks, can be turned into landfill. It also gets used in recipes. Or it can be turned into sludge. And that sludge has many potential uses. It can make crystal slurry if we want to. Probably the big one is it makes the mineral catalyst. And that could be forgetting some things, but it basically can be turned into ore. So since the potential use of the stone is fairly limited, we can process it as a byproduct directly next to where it's being produced, so we don't have to deal with these belts. So just to get an idea, we've got 6 belts of input, and they're kind of zigzagging here, but we've got 6 belts of input and a bunch of machines, hopefully consuming the 6 belts. And they do, because that's 180 per second. But look at the output. So I mentioned that about 1,000 is the most that you can expect out of a pipe. Well, if we processed 6 belts of stone, we're going to get half of a pipe of output of slurry. So that's like a 12-to-1 ratio there of 12 belts of stone can be smashed into 1 pipe of sludge. So logistically, that is much better. There are other concerns. For example, we can make small amounts of mineralized water, which we do occasionally do because we need mineralized water for making plastic and some other things. But this can all be logically controlled. And clearly, if our entire factory is running on like 2 of these, we could probably just put 1 liquefier on every setup and just have some logic connected to the inserters on whether they turn on or off. And the other stone would basically be turned into regular stone. And since we already have this set up here, and we have these belts, it kind of makes sense to leave it, especially considering that, I mean, it's a little tricky because we're also supplementing this with crushed stone from slag if we run too low. So it's not exactly replaceable because a lot of this stuff is hooked up to logic already. But at the very least, we can ensure that we send no more than 6 belts down here because we know that this can handle 6 belts. So if our concept is to use 12, then on site we can have the methods available to get rid of 1 belt of stone, and then 1 belt of stone can be sent down here to this right here. Or another way we can do it is to have the 6 belts and have our 6 belts try to go in, but if it gets clogged, the machine will run its own local method to get rid of the extras. So in other words, if it's logistically backed up, it will have a second way of working. And it kind of seems a little weird right now. We're like, oh, we have 6 belts. Why do we need this many belts? They're not going. It's like, well, they will. If all of these are running at full power, this would be completely packed. So we have a bit of a concept here. And we're still going to want to handle the water locally, except now we're going to need to handle twice as much. But we have a concept. So let's start with the Ceph right here. And looks like we have some empty miners. I might as well pick them up. This is getting fairly empty, but it's still keeping up, so might as well let it keep going. And that's the end of this episode. On the next one, we are going to use Hellmod to figure out what kind of setup we need. Thanks for watching. I'll see you later.